Okay, it's 9:30, so I guess I'll get started. And first I want to ask, does anyone need a sign language interpreter at all? Okay. My name is Rachael, and I work under the name Stuffed Panda Studios making fursuits, and I'm almost at my 10th year anniversary of fursuit making, so that's going to be next week. Yay! And this panel is going to be about designing characters for fursuits, and I want to start out by saying there's no right or wrong way to make a character or a fursuit. This is just kind of my opinion and the process I go through, so hopefully this will give you some ideas. But if you want to make a character that goes against all rules of art and it makes your fursuit maker cry, then that's fine, just don't commission me. So designing a character for a fursuit is different than designing a character that's just going to have 2D art created. And the difference is, number one, a human needs to fit inside comfortably. Some people have different ranges of comfort. Some people are willing to suffer for a certain look, and others just want to be as comfortable as possible. So that's something to keep in mind. You need to consider what kind of space you're going to be in. If you're going to be in a convention space, it's like, okay, if I have giant wings, are people going to constantly be hitting it, or is it getting in the way and being a nuisance? Or maybe it's just something you have at home and that's not really a concern. And then you've also got a limited color palette you're working with. It's gotten better over the years. When I first started, there was hardly any fur colors out there at all, and it's really expanded quite a bit, but it's still something you kind of need to keep in mind and see if there is actually a good quality fur in the colors you want. And then you kind of need a basic understanding of how different materials work and what the different limitations are. And last but not least, you need to consider the cost of it and how hard it's going to be to make. So if you're commissioning someone, the more complicated it is, the more it's going to cost. So you might want to simplify it to kind of take down the price. Or if you're doing it yourself and it's your first fursuit and you don't have that much experience, you might want to also simplify things just a little bit. And you can see some examples on the right side that was by Beast Cub, and that's something I would consider more complicated because it's got a more feral shape, so that would probably cost more and take more time. So when I'm designing a character, there's 3 different places I like to start. You can start with a color scheme of some kind. You can start with a marking or pattern that you have in mind. Or you could start with a theme, like a fruit theme is common, like watermelon, or a sunset theme, something like that. And colors is probably the most common place to start. People usually have favorite colors, or they see furs that they like and they want to base a character off of. So you could base your colors on furs that already exist, which is obviously the easiest. You could pull color schemes from a color wheel. You could pull them from themes or foods, brands, just different things you see out and about. Or you could just straight up do realistic colors based on nature. And choosing colors based on fur, it's kind of overwhelming if you've never worked with furs before. There's just so many out there, and it's hard to tell what's good quality, what's bad quality, what's going to shave well, what's going to be too heavy. So if you're familiar with fur, that's the best place to start, is just looking at what colors are out there. But if you're not, that might be overwhelming, and you might try starting somewhere else. And my best advice is, if you are commissioning someone and you're not really familiar with fur, just be willing to have the colors changed a little bit, maybe a slightly different shade if you can't find exactly what you want in a good quality fur. Yes, just like her fur. We couldn't find the exact shade of blue. I think we ordered like 5 different swatches of blue, so it was a bit of a compromise. But sometimes you just have to do that. You can order custom fur. Sometimes people will do custom runs, but those get expensive and you have to wait a while to get it produced. So I've got some fur swatches to pass around. And these are just common furs that, you know, are in production right now that are easy to find.
Can we start some on some side, some on the other?
Yeah.
You're getting after you have that.
So as far as short furs go, you're pretty safe getting like rabbit, teddy, super seal, or beaver. The nice thing about short furs is you usually don't have to trim it that much, if at all. But the bad thing about it is it shows seams really easily. So you've got to spend a lot of time kind of picking out seams to make it disappear. So it can take just as much time. Medium to long furs are kind of like Arctic Fox, Eco Shag, Luxury Shag, Flocati, Monster, and NFT, which stands for National Fiber Technology. So, as an example, on Panda, this long fluffy fur is Flocati, and it's like 3 to 4 inches long. So you can see how much fluffier this is compared to the muzzle, which is Teddy, and it's been shaved down a little bit, but it was pretty short to begin with. And that's something else you kind of want to look for is if you're planning on matching like short and long furs, see if you can get them to match like tone, because on white, sometimes white is more yellowish. So you'll sew 2 pieces of white together and you'll have one that's really yellow and one that's really bright white. Or on black, when I was working on Panda's suit, on the bodysuit, I was trying to find like short black fur that matched long. And when you photographed it, a lot of the black fur photographed kind of bluish, and then some photographed almost kind of like purplish, and it looked really weird next to each other. So that was kind of an adventure finding a black fur that of different lengths that actually matched and looked right. And some are shinier than others also. To touch on the National Fiber Technology fur, it tends to be really long and kind of wispy fur, and it's not something you would trim because you would just see the backing. It's not really dense. And there's several types of furs like that. Monster kind of falls into that as well. It looks really cool as accents. If you were to pull the fibers back, you could kind of see the backing, but that also allows for a lot of ventilation. It's just not something you would want to trim down. And then unusual stuff, if you see it coming around, there's like Tizable backed fur, which is not a knit. I don't really know what you would describe it, but it kind of wants to shed on the edges. So with normal knit fur, you could just cut it straight across and then you don't have an issue with it falling apart, but with that one it does. So that's something I tend to avoid, but if you do use it, you'll need to kind of seam over the edges. And there's also Mongolian, which is kind of a longer fur. Tinsel has like little sparkly bits of tinsel in it, which is fun. And then two-tone fur, it tends to be a different color when you shave it down. So sometimes there'll be brown fur that you shave down and it's gray because it's gray at the base. So like that fur that she has on hers, the pumpkin, it's got like these little black guard hairs on top. So if you were to shave it down, those would disappear. So when I was working on her head, I had to do a lot of airbrushing to blend it back in because there was definitely a difference when it got shaved down. And this is a list of like popular fur websites that I tend to buy from. You still want to get swatches and kind of check it out and see if they're good quality or not, but Hal Fabrics has really great fabrics. Big Z Fabric, Mendel's, Fursuit Supplies, I'm Stuff Fur, Fabric Empire, and then Minky gets used a lot on fursuits, and it's used for like noses, paw pads, especially on toony stuff, and I like to go through the Minky Boutique, so you can pass those around. If you order swatches, you can get these cool little swatch cards. And then Fleece, I use every once in a while, kind of the same deal. You can use it on gums, noses, paw pads. And some people aren't huge fans of Fleece, but Polartec Fleece is actually really nice and dense, which I have here. Make you go back around. So when you're picking out colors, if you really don't know where to start and you don't know what colors would look nice together, you can kind of go back and just use a color wheel to get some ideas. So some different color schemes you could use would be complementary, monochromatic, analogous, triadic, split complementary, or square. So complementary is opposite colors on the color wheel, which would be like Yukiko, with the orangey fur and the blue accents. They look super awesome together. You could also do it just with eyes, so maybe you could have, I don't know, like a blue suit with orange eyes, and that would also be considered complementary. And you can kind of deviate from the colors a bit, so you don't have to use bright blue and bright orange. You could do like a reddish orange or a brownish color, a navy blue, something like that. Monochromatic is kind of fun. That's where you have one color with tints or shades added. So you could have a suit that has different kinds of blue on it, or you could have a suit that's like pink, red, dark red on it. Analogous are 3 colors next to each other on the color wheel, so that's kind of self-explanatory, but this one's one of my favorites, where you have like a blue with a purple and a reddish purple. Triadic are 3 colors spaced evenly on the color wheel, so you could have something like blue, orange, and green. And then split complementary is a main color with 2 analogous colors to its component. So this is kind of one of my favorite color schemes, having like the bright orange and purple. And then last is the square, where the 4 colors form a square. So you could try something like that too, or you could say tetradic if you want to be fancy. Another color scheme you could try out is one color with some kind of a neutral. So you could do like a white suit with one color. You could do kind of gray and black and have one accent color. An example is the design by Kimono Copy, where you've got the gray and black, but then you've got this like creamy yellow as the accent. So that looks really nice. It makes the horn stand out a lot, which is cool. And then the other example by Char Fursuits is you've got the neutral black and white with that blue color that matches with it. So if you're not a fan of like anything on the color wheel that you've been looking at and you still can't really find any colors that you jive with or you're a fan of, you could try picking colors from a theme or object. So this is a goat I designed that was based on sushi with wasabi. And originally I just saw the colors like on my shelf and I'm like, hey, these colors look kind of fun together, let's use these. And I started sewing, I'm like, wait a minute, this looks like sushi. So I just kind of went with it and made the markings based on sushi. Something else I've thought about doing is making a suit based on like the blue and red from the Nintendo Switch, like doing colors like that. Of course you've got realistic colors from nature. You can make them super accurate to what the animal you're making, or you could possibly do it really realistic with one pop of color. Like you could have an orange tiger, instead of black stripes you could do blue, something like that. Or you could have the realistic tiger colors but then have an unnatural eye color kind of as an accent. You could also do an animal with colors inspired from another, so you could have a raccoon with tiger colors if you're a fan of the tiger colors, but you want just a raccoon. And last but not least, you could just straight up do neutrals. I really like, obviously, white, black, gray, things like that. That always looks nice because then you can kind of focus on the markings more than like bright colors and things like that. So before you start designing markings, you kind of need to know what's possible or what you're willing to pay for, what you're willing to make. And you kind of need to know how fur behaves. So the most common ways to get markings on are either sewing them in or airbrushing them. And there's definitely pros and cons between them, and there tends to be a cost difference. So for me, airbrushing markings is always faster and easier, so I charge less for those than if I was going to sew them all in, and just takes way less time. An example is once I made a cheetah suit, and airbrushing all those spots on took me maybe 3 hours, and if I was hand sewing all those spots on, that would take weeks. So that's a huge price difference, a huge time difference. And it is kind of tricky when you first sewing in markings, getting the hang of it. So if you're new at fursuit making, it might be a little tedious or frustrating. So that's something to keep in mind if you're not willing to deal with it. But airbrushing tends to have a softer look. I feel like it looks more realistic, especially if you're doing stripes or spots, because you kind of get like a little bit of a fading or gradient going on, and it just seems to blend into the rest of the fur better. Like I said, it's usually faster and in turn cheaper. And I haven't done this personally, but you can use stencils for more complicated designs. I've seen people cut really complicated stuff with a Cricut, or cut it out of contact paper with an X-Acto knife and stick on top of the fur. When I did it, I kind of had some trouble because the airbrush wanted to blow under the stencil, but I know people have had like a lot of success with it, so that's something you can try. And then with airbrushing, you can get super nice gradients, which is always kind of cool. The cons of airbrushing is that it will get ruffled if it's windy, or if you're walking through a con, like people are touching your suit and the fur gets all messed up. So if you've got a complicated design, especially on longer fur, and it gets ruffled, the design's not going to look the way it's intended. It's going to look, it's just not going to look the way it's supposed to. And it can fade with repeated washings. It does take a while to start fading. I'll have people on Instagram comment and say, oh, that airbrushing is going to wash out the first time. Like, no, it's not. It's going to take a while, but if you have the suit for years, expect to go back and have to touch it up at some point after it's been washed a while. Sewn markings, of course, they don't fade over time, so the designs look, just as crisp 5 years in the future as they do now. It looks better when the fur gets ruffled because the base of the fur is that color that you want. It still might not look exactly the same as what you intend, but it looks better than airbrush markings. And you can do some really crisp, clean designs with sewn markings. So on this hyena I hand sewed all of the markings in, and then I went back with airbrushing and touched up the edges to make them a little bit sharper. So that was kind of a combination of the two. So that's a possibility as well. But yeah, sewing in markings, it's more expensive and time consuming. So it's just going to depend on what you want to spend or what you want to do. And some tiny markings might not be able to be sewn in if they're super itty bitty. So that might be better left to hand painting or using a stencil or something like that. And then I don't have an example of it on here, but you also want to keep in mind the type of fur that you have. If you've got really long fur and you're sewing in like this itty bitty detailed design with more long fur, when you flip it over, it's not gonna look the same. It's either gonna need to be trimmed down to kind of expose the design, or you're gonna have to use short fur on long fur to get it to show up the way you intend. So there are different types of markings and patterns. You could have very rounded, soft markings that are very flowy. You could have markings that have a lot of movement to them or no movement at all. You could have maximalist design where it's just tons of markings, like really crazy, energetic design. Or minimal where you'd have like a solid colored suit with one big marking somewhere. Again, going back to kind of when I was talking about themes with the colors, is you could also draw inspiration from the world around you for your markings. So if there's a logo you really like, just because you kind of like the shape and style of it, you could kind of take some inspiration from that. Nature, just anything you see around you, just keep your eyes open. If you see something consistently that's catching your eye, like maybe you keep seeing like flowy, swirly logos and designs catching your eye, that might be something you want to incorporate into one of your suits. And then of course you can also do accurate markings based on the animal that you're making. You'll probably want to tweak them to look appealing on your fursuit, but you can kind of use that as heavy inspiration. So the first one is rounded versus angular designs. Rounded designs are kind of like swirls, circles, cloud shapes, curves, things like that. And angular are very sharp, like arrows, triangles, squares, things of that nature. And high versus low movement. High movement is kind of when there's a focal point and then you've got other markings that draw your eye around the suit. So the one on the left by Kimono Copy has great movement to it. You can clearly see how all the markings are connected. It really draws your eye across the suit and down to the tail. So having connected markings is kind of a cool strategy to show off your whole design. And then low movement would be what I consider just like a solid color or a few colors with one strong focal point, like the one on the right, instead of having a lot of lines and things. So you can have a design, a maximalist design that's got a lot of markings that is very busy. That would be like Maple on the left. I've seen a lot of suits that are even more busy than that, but it kind of gives you an idea. The front of him really has a lot going on. There's a lot of triangles and points, and he's got little circles and diamonds on his head. So there's a lot to look at. Whereas the one on the right is more simple, where it's basically just a solid color, and your focus is more on the wings and the horns. So if you've got something you want to highlight, like you've got really cool wings, you might want to consider making your body more simplified so that your attention is drawn to that. And as far as being inspired by the world around you, Maple was inspired by the plates in my house. I just really like the colors on my plates. I'm like, hey, I have this fur in stock. Why don't I try making a suit with it? And I think it worked pretty good. So just keep your eyes out. And if you see something like plates, clothing, anything, you never know when you could find color or marking inspiration for a suit. And these are some examples of things I want to base suits on in the future. So like I said, the Switch, or, the Game Boy Pokemon with like the yellow, red, and blue would be kind of cool. The plant in the top, I think it's an aglaonemia where it's green with pink, I think would be really fun. Not really watermelon colors, but kind of more of a foresty green, I think would be cool. Recently I did a wolf that was sunset colors, so that would be the bottom middle. Just things like that to keep an eye out for. And then realistic markings would be based on the animal that you were designing, trying to make it as accurate as possible, and just accounting for your body shape and kind of moving it around. Again, if you're commissioning someone and you don't want to spend as much money, if you're doing like a cheetah and you want sewn in spots, you might consider doing less spots and not as many as an actual realistic cheetah would have. So you can kind of simplify to get the price down. So once you've kind of got an idea of what kind of markings you want and what color and maybe what kind of fur you want to use, now you've got to combine it. And something I think about when I'm making suits is, are there any areas that you want to highlight or any areas that you want to downplay? What kind of fur links do you want to use? I try and use at least 2 different fur links on fursuits. I don't like to use just one length because I think it adds visual interest. And I'll kind of talk about it in a bit, but you can also use the links to downplay and highlight areas as well. You want to think about repeating markings throughout your suit for a cohesive design or colors. You want some negative and positive space so your whole suit's not just crazy busy. And then something else is symmetrical or asymmetrical. And a tip is, if you're doing a digital drawing of your character and you're trying to figure out the markings, you can make multiple save files or multiple layers and try out different styles and see what you like best. And that saves a lot of time. An example of using markings and colors to influence the shape of your suit is, you can see this is the same duct tape dummy, and the markings that you have on the stomach completely changes the way it looks without any padding at all. So Yukiko is an awesome example with the way her markings are in the center. She designed the character completely herself, and having that marking come in makes the character look more curvy without adding any padding. So that's something that you could do if you want your suit to look more curvy, but you just don't want to deal with adding any padding on. And you could also make yourself look more blocky, like the third picture, by changing the way the stomach markings are. And I actually took a picture and I forgot that was in there. But I just absolutely love her design. I think it's so nice. I really love how the stomach marking worked out. Fur length, longer fur makes sections look larger, and shorter fur makes them look smaller. So I don't have the full suit here, and I didn't take photos before I left. But on Panda, I wanted her feet and hands to look as tiny as possible. So I made them out of short fur. And then the rest of the bodysuit was like really long 4-inch fluffy fur. So when it's all together, the feet look extra tiny and small just because of that. So if you wanted to do the opposite and you wanted your paws to look really big, you could use longer fur or denser fur. So an example on these first hands, on the fingers I use short fur, and then on the wrist I use long fur to make the hands seem a little smaller. Because the customer had bigger hands and we were trying to make it look in proportion with the rest of the suit. On Yukiko, we use longer fur on the chest to make it look really fluffy. And we also had some like on the elbows and things like that. And Buttercup's arm is on the far right. And I use short fur for most of it, but then I use like long Mongolian underneath to add a fringe, just because that was accurate to the species I was making. So when you're working on putting markings on your character design, you typically want to repeat the elements. You don't have to repeat the exact same marking over and over. But an example on Maple is I wanted triangles and kind of diamond shape. So on the top of his head, he's got, I don't know if you can see it, he's got these little bitty white diamonds to kind of pull it in from his body. He's got the ends of his ears kind of form little arrows, and then he's got the little arrows on his legs. And on his arm, where that brown and white meets, it's like a little triangle shape rather than just doing a straight line across, because I was just trying to repeat that style. And then on the back where his neck flap is, I did that sharp triangle rather than leaving it straight across. And then on the character that Char Fursuits designed, you can see that little, I don't know what you call it, that little shape is repeated multiple times. You can see it up there on the top of the shoulders, it comes into a point. Down on the legs it comes into a point, and then up by the head it also comes into a point. So that element is repeated throughout the suit to kind of tie it together. And then Suki is on the right. And I repeated the gold element in a couple different places because I knew I wanted the moon on the forehead to be gold. And I wanted to bring gold in a few other places, but I didn't want to kind of overwhelm it. So I did the inside of the ears gold, and then I also tried to make the bell about the same color. So that's something you can do too. If you want to add accessories to your suit that match like your eyes to kind of draw that color down, that's something you could do. And a tip is when you are designing, I don't recommend putting complex markings across like your wrist, your ankles, or where the neck flap overlaps. It is possible to use zippers to zip it on or magnets, but it just makes it more complicated. And like, let's say you do manage to get the markings on your back neck flap lined up with your back. As soon as you turn your head, the neck flap's going to move and it's not lined up anymore. So unless you're walking around the convention like perfectly stiff and still, it's not going to stay lined up. So that's something I recommend, is just keeping in mind where things are going to overlap and trying not to do anything complicated there. And then once you've got your markings repeated and you've kind of got the design going down, you want to keep in mind where negative space is. You typically want to have some negative space so your suit isn't too busy. So a lot of times the negative space on a suit is just like the stomach. People tend to have like a white stomach or a stomach panel that has no markings on it, kind of as a visual resting area. So the suit by Kimono Copy has the white going down the stomach all the way onto the arms. That's really nice because then it draws your eye to the hearts. Whereas if you had hearts all over the body, it wouldn't look quite as nice because this just highlights it better. And then Yancha on the other side, I used the white around his muzzle and his neck flap and the paws as kind of my negative space. And then also his stomach I just left without markings. And then with your design, if you want to be adventurous, you can do an asymmetrical design where your markings are not perfectly symmetrical in both halves. It could be a little off. And symmetrical is the most common just because it's cheaper, it takes less patterning, it's easier to put together. Because when I make patterns for suits, I pattern one side and flip it. So if someone has an asymmetrical design, it's going to take more work and it's going to end up costing more. So it can be really cool looking, it just depends on what you want to spend and what you want to try and do. A compromise you could do is have symmetrical markings but have different colors on each side, and that wouldn't take any more patterning. The wolf I did on the left is an asymmetrical airbrushing job, but the markings that I sewed in were actually symmetrical. So that didn't really take me any more work than normal because I was airbrushing it anyway. Doing symmetrical airbrushing is actually harder, so that didn't matter too much in that case. But as far as sewing goes, symmetrical is definitely easier. Vision is something else you have to keep in mind. Some people are totally fine with low vision. Other people want the biggest vision possible. When I first started making suits, I was like willing to suffer to wear a cool fursuit. So if I had really bad vision, I didn't care if I looked cool. I just had a handler like help me around. And now that I've done this 10 years, I'm just like, I want to be able to see. I would like to go out without a handler. I don't want to have someone with me. So I put in bigger vision ports all of the time. So the most common for realistic suits is having tear duct vision. You could just do the little tear ducts, or you could expand it out like I typically do and have it come down further. And there are ways to blend it in so you don't just see like this big patch of mesh. And that gives you more vision. But it depends on how comfortable you are with painting and airbrushing. The easiest thing to do by far is just doing like black mesh in the tear ducts. Pupils, seeing through them and using window tint is something new I tried on this suit. So the pupil in this is just window tint that I look out of. The downside to that is they could fog up. I do have a fan in here and I've worn it like 45 minutes so far without any issues, but I'm sure if I was doing it longer I could run into problems with it, so that's something you want to think about. Like, do you want to stop and take off the suit head or deal with the fogging? You could also, if you're doing toony eyes, just use straight up mesh to see out of, and then you won't have any fogging issues without any of this plastic on top. Mouth vision isn't super common, but it's more common in like mascot costumes. I think Beast Cub's done a lot of mouth vision suits. Yeah, she does a lot of really cool stuff. So the one on the bottom is a mascot I did for school, and I think that was the only time I've done a mouth vision on a suit. But that one was mounted on like a bicycle helmet, and then you looked out through the mouth. It actually had really good vision, but it does make the head a lot bigger. And then the suit at the top, the unicorn that Beast Cub did, is neck vision, and she does a lot of neck vision suits that look super cool. And I think she typically mounts them on a bicycle helmet as well, and just has mesh that you see out of on the neck. I've also seen her do like collars and stuff on the neck, and then you see out through the collar, so that would kind of distract from where the vision's at. So you can get a lot of cool shapes if you're willing to, change where the vision on your suit is at. I didn't actually make it, but I was going to make her a dinosaur, like a brontosaurus with the head mounted on a bicycle helmet. And then we were going to wrap a scarf around the neck, and we were going to have vision through the scarf. So you could use accessories to kind of hide where that stuff's at. Something else to keep in mind is planning for travel and convention spaces. Like I had someone commission me for a winged cheetah, and originally they wanted these huge wings, and I kind of talked to them about, well, when you're in a con space, you're probably going to have people run into you. It's going to be kind of awkward getting on the escalator, and they're like, oh, we'll try it, we'll see. If it's too much of a pain, I can commission you for something smaller. And then after con, they're like, yeah, I want some smaller wings. So you have to think about, you know, the people around you as well. You don't want to be a nuisance to everyone. And you want to be able to pack it if you're flying. So if you're planning on driving to conventions, it might not be as big of a deal. But if you do think you'll be flying a lot, you want to think about what you can get in a suitcase if you're not willing to ship it to the convention. Magnets are something I use a lot. The little cheetah wings there were actually magnetic. I had like a plate that went under the shirt, and then the wings had magnets that attached on the outside. I've done tails that way that attach from the outside with magnets. I've done rabbit ears that come on and off with magnets that were kind of cool, and that made it way easier to pack. And then the goat I did in the bottom right had removable horns as well, because those can be kind of fragile. So you could wrap them up in bubble wrap when you're traveling.
You had a question back here.
Oh, yep.
How strong are the magnets you use?
I use rare earth magnets, and they're pretty dang strong. Sometimes if I'm doing something that's really heavy and they're not holding well enough, you can kind of double them up. So glue two magnets together on top of each other on each part, and that makes it stronger. And you also have to be careful if it's going through fabric or fur. You might need to have a stronger magnet. But yeah, they're pretty strong because you want to make sure they're really sturdy and they don't just randomly fall off when you're walking around. But yeah, I think that's about it. So are there any more questions? Yes.
In terms of like different fur types, do you think there's, I'm sure someone's done it, but has used like wool, like actual sheep or alpaca wool for a fursuit?
I haven't heard of anyone doing it. The only thing I could think of is that it might be hot.
Well,
And
definitely it's gonna be warm.
yeah, but that would actually look pretty cool. You could probably do it for accents and stuff. Like use wool for like a tuft of hair or something. And I don't know what the maintenance would be on that, like if it would want to kind of felt together or get matted. But yeah, that would be kind of cool to use for accents. Yep.
Do you have any thoughts and suggestions on placing markings on bodysuits and with regard to the usual seams that are on bodysuits?
Ooh, that's a good question. Let me think. I'd say avoid doing anything complicated around like the armpit area. There's a lot of, usually I put like a gusset under the arm so people can actually raise their arms. So if you've got like a complicated marking that goes around there, it'd get in the way and look kind of funky. Otherwise, it doesn't really get in the way too much. I usually have a lot of seams on my suits. I have a lot of darts and stuff to get it to curve right. So I just have to be really careful when I'm patterning and make markings on the fur so everything lines up really well. That was an issue I had when I first started, is I wouldn't add little hash marks when I cut pieces off, and then the markings would be slightly off when I'd sew the darts together. So with practice, for the most part, you can kind of work with it. Just under the arms is the biggest issue. Does anybody else have any questions? Yep.
For species that don't have fur, like avians or anything reptilian, what would you say is the best route to take with something like that?
So far when I've been commissioned for those, everyone still wanted fur, and we just did shorter fur. I've seen Beast Cub use like bubble fur to kind of simulate scales. I've also seen people use longer fur and then actually cut feathers in or scales in, which is super tedious, but it actually looks really cool when it's done. Otherwise, you could use fleece. That would show more wrinkles, would be the issue. you'd have to spend a lot more time patterning it. But yeah, for the most part, I would say short fur and just using some trimming techniques or airbrushing techniques to simulate scales or feathers. And I've also used, I've made felt and fleece feathers before and sewn them in, so that's something you could do. You could probably do it with scales too. You might even be able to 3D print scales like chainmail or something. That might be heavy, but that could kind of look cool. Does anybody else have any questions? Yep.
At average, if you were doing a full body figure-eight padded suit, what amount of time would you spend from planning to the actual finished piece, would you say?
If the customer already has a design for me, I'd probably spend a couple weeks working on patterning and translating the design to a duct tape dummy, because sometimes people will give me reference sheets and the markings don't line up with the duct tape dummy. Maybe they're shorter or taller than what their reference is. So I kind of have to work around that, and I'll send them pictures like, I'll kind of do what I think looks best and then send pictures like, hey, this is slightly off from your reference. Do you want me to change it or make adjustments? So I'd say a couple weeks back and forth just trying to figure it out. When I was working on my own suit, I did it pretty quickly, like in a couple of days, because I just kind of knew what I wanted, so.
Maker sent out a test body suit, I call them dummies, like a blank suit for them to make sure that everything fits correctly.
Make them like a test one out of scrap fabric, or?
Like Polar Fleece is what I would use.
Oh, okay. I used to do that, and then I kind of got away from it. And I started doing duct tape patterns for the bodysuits, and then I just kind of figured out over time where to add in some ease or the gussets. But yeah, when I first started, that's what I did. If I was using a really expensive fur or a rare fur that was out of production, I would probably do that just to be 100% sure. And you had a question?
Yeah, if someone has like a character that's only drawn as like feral, how do you translate that like patterning to an upright and row?
Yeah, that's really challenging. I would start by, if they don't have a duct tape dummy of themselves, maybe taking a picture of themselves, having someone take a picture of them like in a T-pose and taking it into Procreate and overlaying their design and kind of just playing with markings from there and seeing what looks good. Just kind of thinking about what looks good with your body shape. Are there areas that you want to highlight or try and stay away from? And just kind of experiment. But yeah, let me see. I think the first one, Beast Cub, once again. She does a lot of, like this one, the unicorns over here. They still kind of look feral. So you could kind of go that route too and keep it more of a feral design. The downside to that is like with hooves or like feral paws, it's harder to hold stuff and, you know, move around versus anthro hands. Yes. Yep.
This kind of goes along with questions about like editing designs before you actually go into like the making of the suit.
Uh-huh.
But I guess I wonder what your process is for asking clients to like bring the complexity level down, or again, like if you have to go back and forth with them on markings and placement when it comes to like their actual physical size.
Right.
What is that process like for you? Is it more like you need a sheet up front that is good to go, or is it a back and forth?
A lot of fursuit makers want a sheet up front that's good to go, but for me, I usually go back and forth with the customer a lot. I'm willing to work with them. If someone applies for a slot and the markings are too complicated and I'm like, I don't know if I could pull this off, or I don't know if I could make it look good, I will straight up tell them up front, like, hey, I like your design, but the way you have these markings here, I don't think are going to look good, or I don't think I could pull it off. Could we try this? And if you're willing to, it would cost this much. But as far as just marking placements, like if their sizes or height are different from the reference sheet, I just kind of do what I think looks best. and then I will email them and show them a picture of the duct tape dummy, like from the front, side, 3/4, and sometimes if it's complicated, I'll take a video of it like spinning because I hang them from the ceiling, which creeps everyone out, but so that way they can kind of get an idea of what it looks like all the way around. And I just go back and forth. Like they might say, oh, move the marking up closer to my hip, and then I'll do it, and they might be like, oh, you're right, that looks kind of weird, let's bring it back down, or they might like it that way. So I just kind of try and communicate and really show pictures of it all the way around so they can get a good idea of what it's gonna look like. Does anybody else have any more questions? Yep.
In your opinion, is there such a thing as too boring of a suit or design?
Not really. Even if it's like a solid white fursuit, that can still be really fun to work on. I'm more interested in the shape, honestly. So if someone wanted a solid white wolf, I would still have fun making a really realistic wolf base and maybe playing with the expression and the eyes and things like that. And it's actually really fun and satisfying to do, really simple designs every once in a while. And it makes it easier to pattern. Yep.
Character that you would really enjoy or love working on that you haven't been asked to do yet? Like if you had the opportunity and it popped up, you'd be like, absolutely.
I have been wanting to make a possum or a pangolin. An anteater would be fun. A mole, I've been telling my sister I really want to make. Dinosaur would be cool. Yeah, like a giant toony mole with like huge claws and glasses or something would be fun.
That would be fun with glasses.
Yes, that would be awesome. I think that'd be so fun. Yeah. Yeah. A sloth would be cool. A bat would be fun too. I haven't done wings in quite a while.
I did like the sugar glider. I'd see it every so often.
Yeah, that was super fun to make. And on that one I had like fleece kind of wings, and then I did free motion sewing on top, which if you're not familiar, you use like a darning foot and then you lower the feed dogs so then you can kind of draw with thread. So I did kind of fun designs on that. It was really cool. Anybody else? Yep.
You ever get asked to make accessories?
Yes, I do.
What's that like?
Sometimes it's stressful. It depends on what it is. Like I made a bell accessory for my suit. I've made bell accessories for several suits in the past, and stuff like that's really fun. For Yukiko, the wig kind of counts as an accessory, but I made glasses for her and a headset. Like anything that's kind of 3D sculptural is really fun. I've been asked to make costumes that go on top of the suits, like clothing, and those are a lot harder and not as fun. So I did a few of those, and I won't do those again just because I feel like my clothing sewing skills are not as good as fursuit skills. But 3D accessories are super fun. Anybody else? Yep.
Last one. For species that have wings, one, how much of a nightmare is that? And two, do you think it's better to do back wings, hand wings, or kind of a hybrid on the arms?
I'd say kind of a hybrid on the arms maybe would be my favorite. But I think I've done all three actually. One of the first fursuits I made was a macaw, and I just had like regular wings that went all the way out to their fingers, and I just had like the longer feathers be their hands so they could still kind of grab stuff because it was fleece. I've done back wings several times, and those have actually been the hardest and taken me the longest for some reason. I think because I make them more complicated and I try and make them kind of accurate. Like I did a griffin that was based on an owl, like a barn owl, so I actually found reference images of a barn owl wing, so I printed them out and I did each individual feather with felt with wire in it and airbrushed it. So yeah, that was a lot. But yeah, I'd say the hybrid, would probably be the easiest to make and then easiest to kind of grab stuff and more practical. Anybody else? Yep.
I was curious, where did you find Panda's bill, and why did you change it from the rope design to, I guess, more like collar?
She always had just kind of like the collar fabric design. The other suits I've done with bells did have the rope, but the bell, I actually found a Jingle Bell 3D model that someone had already done, and I bought it, and then I just scaled it up and 3D printed it. I used my resin 3D printer, so it didn't have the lines and stuff on it, and I just did it in 4 parts, glued it together, sanded it, primed it, and did the gold finish on the outside. But I tried modeling a bell myself, and it didn't look the best, so. So yeah, buying a model for like $5 was definitely the way to go. Saved a lot of time. Anybody else? Okay, I guess that's it. Thank you guys for coming.
Silver Gattoman, he bought me a coffee. Silver Gattoman, here is the song for thee. He likes to video all the panels at the cons. You should go and watch them whether they are short or long. Silver Gattoman, you video that's not a jibe. All of you go to his YouTube channel and like and subscribe.